Okay, so Paul at this point has been putting his letter together mainly to answer the question of how are Jews and Gentiles going to live together as one community in Rome. And that might seem strange to us, but that was a huge deal. Like up until this point, there was a massive divide between Jew and Gentile. They would separate themselves, and now in this strange way, this Messiah has come, torn down that barrier, and they are to live as one people. That's the background of Romans. But there's something else, at least one other thing, that Paul is doing, and you get hints of it here in chapter 8, that something is happening on the political level that is going to make it very hard to be a follower of Jesus very soon. Now, the dating of Paul's letters is tricky, but as it turns out, he was right. Emperor Nero was the first major persecutor of Christians. He, in particular, liked to light them on fire and let them burn for his dinner parties. Welcome to St. Paul's. And that's that's just what he did. And so when Paul starts talking about the struggles or the trials that are to come and all of that, he's trying to encourage his people, saying that this is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. You're going to be okay. But then Paul takes a really hard shift. He goes into this creation kind of language, and it isn't clear right away why. This talk about creation groaning and creation being in labor pains, waiting for something to happen. And the answer to what Paul is, or the question of what is Paul doing, actually would seem very obvious to him, but us being 2,000 years later is not. But you get a better hint of it in verse 29, when it talks about the, quote, likeness of Jesus. Now, likeness is a bad translation. In Greek, it's icon. Image would be a much better way. He is using image language. Now, we often talk about humans bearing the image of God, and, well, what does that mean? And a lot of people might say, well, it means that we have this immortality, or we have creativity, or this awareness of God, or something like that, or we're rational minds. That's not it at all. But in order to get to that, which is why Paul goes there, we need to go back to Genesis 1 through 3. These are the chapters that talk about the creation of the universe. God is the creator, and he, in chapter 1, goes through these steps, these days, 7 days of creating our world. And on day 6, he says, let us make man in our own image. And so, male and female, he created them. He takes these things called humans, and they bear his image, and they are placed into creation. Now, if we could go back in time and read this to an ancient Near Eastern person, they would know exactly what he's talking about, what Moses is talking about. They would say, oh, you've made your image, you're putting it into creation, you're talking about a temple. Now we say, what? And I realize that the creation narratives can be kind of a minefield of controversy. We're just going to bracket that out because, that's just a whole other ball of wax. In other words, it would be very obvious for an ancient Near Eastern person that you've got an image placed into something that you've constructed. Well, that is a temple. God, in revealing his story of creation, is using the worldview of his audience, because everybody knew that you place that the God would, or the priests or the God would place the image in the temple, and then the next step is that God can then reside or bring his presence into that temple. So what happens in day 7? That's when God rests. He takes up his residence in creation. And his image bearers are his representative. They're like God's statues. You, as bearers of God's image, are like etched statues of God. Not in that you would worship a statue, that's idolatry, but rather it gives you his task for us in creation. We are to be the ambassadors, the representatives. We are like a foreign ambassador. You are a representative of your country. We were to be representatives of God, to cultivate, to have dominion, to bring order, to plant, to grow, to rule over creation in such a way that it reflects the wisdom and grace of the Creator. And then in the same way, when creation does what it's supposed to do, and it expresses this beauty and this order and this cosmic significance, then we would take those praises, so to speak, and then echo them back up to the Creator. It's a two-way street. And in chapter 2 of Genesis, 2 and 3, when he gets a little more specific and he selects a man and a woman, a family, and he puts them in this garden and gives them this role to have dominion, to keep and to guard, avad and shamar in Hebrew, words that were always used in terms of worship. They were having dominion. When they name the animals, that is not just a cute, like now you have pets. That is a very powerful way of talking about how humans are in relation to creation. Now, something went terribly wrong. The image stopped representing God. Like a statue that had been smashed. It no longer looks like him. It no longer acts like him. It no longer possesses that wisdom and grace to rule over creation. See, when God says, like, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, popular culture is like, well, they just ate an apple and then got really mad or something like that. No, that's not it at all. The explanation is simple. What is the knowledge of good and evil? It's wisdom. Wisdom is a good thing. As I raise my 4-year-old son, you can bet I'm at least trying, some days better than others, to teach him between good and evil so that he would have the knowledge of good and evil and make the right choice. The problem for Adam and Eve was that they reached out and grabbed wisdom for themselves and did not get it from God. And we have all, every single one of us here, have been victims of somebody defining wisdom for themselves rather than deriving it from the Creator. That is endemic to the human experience. So the image is crushed. We no longer reflect this wisdom and this grace from God, but we still have dominion over the earth. It's a little wild. It's a little more untamed. But we have taken creation and done amazing, incredible, inventive things with what God has given us. We have also poisoned it horribly, misused it and abused it in terrible ways, which tells us that we don't have everything that we had when we really, truly represented God. So this is why Paul starts talking about how creation itself is like in labor pains, which with only secondary experience really seems like it's terrible. Because, I haven't, firsthand given birth. But the creation itself on this cosmic level are waiting, yearning, groaning for the true image bearers to return, to take up where they left off, to re-engage creation in this wise and gracious way, to truly represent God in his world. For Paul, this has begun. That Jesus comes to earth and he enters into reality. He takes on the imperfection of flesh, physically, so to speak, and he lives as God's true image bearer, a truly human being who is also God in the flesh. And he goes to his death And by going to his death, he defeats death itself. That something happened that first Easter morning when Jesus walked out of his tomb, that new creation, this redemption, this revitalization, this renewal has begun already, which makes creation excited and expectant, but still in pain, because it's starting to happen. This new creation, this redemption, this healing has begun with Jesus. And now, as Jesus' followers expand and continue outward, and people who bear his Spirit go out and live in the world, by the way, that's you guys, that creation is waiting for the moment when it is finished. But Paul is saying that the very Spirit of God that did all of this is at work and alive in you right here and right now. That God raised Jesus from the dead, and he is actively raising the dead within you. That when you received his Spirit in your baptism, something happened. That image is being repaired. And there will come a day when that image is fully everything it had meant to be. But not yet. And this is the tension that Paul calls our attention to. We have this incredible promise. We are children, legal adopted children of God. We are given the Spirit of God who is at work in us, who is working through us in creation and building this reign and rule of God. That there will be a day when God brings justice finally to the world. It is renewed, resurrected. It is healed. Our wounds are healed. Our scars are no more. That we will stand as image bearers of God. But right now is terrible. I'm a mess. You're a mess. Our relationships are a mess. We stand in this tension of things. We've got this amazing promise, but I don't know if I'm going to be employed next week, and I'm hungry. My children don't speak to me. I want to stop, but I can't. My relationships are falling apart, and I'm alone. That this creation, even within us, is groaning and yearning for redemption. And so Paul points out something very special about what God did with Jesus and what that means for us. And in order to explain it, I need to relive a very dark moment of my life that happened about 3 weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago. I don't know. It was bad. I can't even remember when it was. We had gone on this vacation, and some of you may have heard this already because I've been complaining about it since. We went on this vacation, and Nash, my 4.5-year-old, got really sick, like 103-degree fever, like at night, and he was coughing and crying, and it started hallucinating and telling us that the monsters all have torches and stuff, and yeah, that's scary things. But he was giggling, so we were cool with it. And just coughing and hacking and this upper respiratory thing. We had to take him to urgent care, and they gave him some medication, a couple of different kinds, to help bring the inflammation down, but one of them was a steroid. And if you're an adult that has taken steroids, you know they can make you just crazy, almost manic. Well, it turns out if you give it to a 4-year-old who can't really regulate his emotions all that well to begin with, he goes nuts. And so for a week, it was horrible. And I mean that like, it really wasn't funny as time went on. It got bad. We couldn't do anything that we wanted to do while we were there. He was just a wreck, and he would start screaming at us, and then he would start coughing, and then scream, and then cough, and then puke, and then so on and so forth. It was awful. So Friday rolls around, and we're going to fly home. And I've got to fly home Friday night. I've got to make sure everything's good going on here. We have a guest preacher, and Scott's out of town, and I've got to make sure everything's good for the guest preacher, and I've got to be on my game the next day, Sunday morning, and then in Sunday afternoon, I've got to fly out for a grad school course, a course that is particularly just very, very complicated. I've got to make sure all of my work is prepared. It ended up being 30 plus pages of review notes that I had to turn in. And so, okay, I can do this. We just had the vacation from hell, and we can do this. So we get a ping that morning that the flight's been delayed a couple hours. That's an odd thing to do in the morning, but okay. And we just start hitting refresh compulsively over the day, and the flight just kept getting delayed a little bit more. Now we're panicking. I'm panicking because I'm thinking if that flight gets canceled, that's going to make things really complicated here, and I need to be in Portland by Monday morning. So we get to the airport. It doesn't get canceled, but it did end up getting delayed by about 6 hours. And poor Nash, like he's just laid out on the ground in the airport, and I'm just watching that clock and doing math in my head. Like, okay, it's 10 o'clock here. I don't know when that's is that 8 o'clock in California time? Math is hard. Okay, the flight is this number of hours, but time change, and midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., I'm never going to get home. So finally, we fly out. We get home at 2:30 in the morning, or we fly into LAX. That's your first problem. So we get there, we're exhausted, but we're surviving. We get to the parking garage, get into the car, vroom, won't start. It's like click, click, click. It sounded like a battery issue, but we tried to jump it and did not have any luck. Click, click, click. And I'm freaking out on the inside. I'm freaking out on the outside. What do we do? Jumping it didn't work. I call the Allstate version of AAA, and he goes, well, it's going to be a while before we can get a wrecker out to tow your car. Wait, are you in a parking garage? Yes. What floor? 5th floor. We don't have anything that can pull the car out of a spot on the 5th floor. I'm like, but what do I do? I need an adult. So eventually we hang up, we take the Uber, and then we realize that the fare for the Uber home and then back was less than what we paid for parking, that was the moment I knew I was going to have a stroke. And, and so we get home. I sleep for like 3 hours, and then I'm up and I'm going to talk to my parents because they live nearby. And so we so they meet me actually at Walmart, and I've got a car battery just hoping and praying. It's like I'm a Lutheran, but it's like I'll say a Hail Mary if it works. Not really. Don't tell anybody I said that. Anyway. And so, we're driving up with this battery, and I'm thinking, if this does not work, my plan C is to file the VIN number, take the license plates, and set that thing on fire, because I don't know what else to do. And I mean, I joke about it now, but I had no idea what was going to happen after that if it didn't work. So we get there, we pop the battery in, put the key in, and boom, it starts just fine. And I realize, this is going to be okay. I still have some messes to clean up. Some battery acid turns out spilled, and I had to clean that up, and still had a bunch of prep work to do for class. Got to make sure Katie and Nash are situated for me to go out of town, make sure I'm at least somewhat collected for church. But once that car came back to life, everything was going to be okay. It still was terrible. I still had a lot of work to do. But that was the sign that we were going to make it. And Paul, as he calls creates this cosmic picture of what happened when Jesus was raised from the dead, is that same message. If God raised Jesus from the dead, you are going to be okay. It's going to hurt. It's going to be hard. You're going to struggle. There is no use in minimizing how bad it can get. But there will stand a day when you realize you're fine, because you are part of this resurrection people. That because God raised Jesus from the dead, Paul can say, like that last line in chapter 8, one of the most beautiful lines in all of Scripture, for I am convinced that neither death nor life, angels or demons or powers or principalities or heights or depths or anything else created is able to separate us from the love of God which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. That if God has raised Jesus from the dead, he has forgiven you, he has given you his Spirit, that same Spirit is raising you from the dead here and now, even though it's hard, even though you're struggling, even though you don't know where your next meal is coming from, and you are so alone, you are going to be okay. Because none of that can separate you from the love of God. Because God raised Jesus from the dead, and he will do the same for you. Let's pray.